Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Yesterday, something unbelievable happened to me, though it was not the kind of event that would make headlines or even look like much to anyone who was not at that table, but to me it felt like the ground shifted under my chair. Because when you sit across from your family and hear your own brother laugh and call you a failure while everyone else looks down at their plates, pretending not to notice, you do not just hear words, you hear a judgment that has probably been waiting for years to slip out. It happened at a Sunday dinner, one of those supposedly normal gatherings that are meant to remind you that family sticks together, even though in practice it often means one or two people get to play king of the hill while the rest keep quiet. My brother Ethan was already bragging before the food had even cooled, listing off new clients he had landed, painting a picture of himself as a self-made man holding up the entire Reed family name on his shoulders, and then, as if he could not resist adding insult to injury, he looked right at me and said, "You're the example of what not to do, Ava. You're basically the family failure." He laughed after saying it, like it was a punchline, and the others let the moment slide because who really wants to pick a fight when the food is still warm? I sat there, not saying much, letting him run his mouth, because I knew from long experience that arguing in that room was like throwing water into the ocean. No one would see it and nothing would change. Instead, I listened, carefully, to the things he thought were throwaway lines, but to me were pieces of a puzzle. He mentioned his new expansion schedule, though the way he phrased it made me wonder if it was more dream than plan. He complained about a vendor who had been slow to deliver parts, slipping out that the invoices were late and he was tired of chasing them. He bragged about one big corporate contract that was keeping the lights on, words that told me more than he realized, because a healthy business does not live or die on a single client. The parents did what they always do, which is sit in silence and pretend neutrality is the same as fairness. My father, Walter, folded his arms and cleared his throat like he always does when he wants a conversation to shift without him being the one to intervene, and my mother, Linda, stared at her plate as though it held all the answers she did not want to voice. I recognized it as the same silence they had practiced for years, a silence that allowed Ethan to be the loud one while I was expected to make peace. That night I decided I was done playing that part. I excused myself early, which raised no eyebrows because they all probably assumed I was sulking, and maybe they even whispered that I had proved Ethan right by walking away, but what I was really doing was storing away every detail of what he had said. I knew enough about his industry from my own work to catch the signs he was leaking without realizing it. Late invoices. Overdependence on one client. Expansion plans that were more about ego than feasibility. Staff he mocked in passing instead of valuing. That night I did not pace or rant. I pulled out a notebook and wrote down the names he had mentioned, the phrases he had used, and the weaknesses I could see even through his bragging. If he wanted to call me a failure, then I would show him what failure really looked like, not in a childish shouting match across the table, but in a way he would never see coming. Later, when I got home, I sent a short text to my mother thanking her for dinner. I added a line for Ethan that looked innocent enough. "You're right, I should aim higher." I knew his ego well enough to predict exactly how he would respond. Within minutes, he sent back a photo of his truck and a line about how I could always come work for him if I needed a paycheck. I didn't respond. I saved it. Sometimes the best way to prepare for a fight is not to swing first, but to let the other person tell you exactly where to land the punch. I went to bed that night not angry, not even hurt anymore, but strangely calm, because for the first time in years I realized that I did not need to argue for my place in that family, and I certainly did not need to shout back at Ethan to prove him wrong. All I needed to do was pay attention, because the more he bragged, the more he revealed, and the more I listened, the more I understood that the real difference between us was that he mistook noise for strength, while I was finally ready to let silence do the heavy lifting. Do you know your true worth? I didn't, not really, not at that dinner table when the laughter still stung, but sitting there with my notes and his careless words replaying in my mind, I felt the first quiet flicker of it. What I did next would not just shift the balance between us, it would redefine it completely. And that was the thought that let me sleep easier than I had in years. When I woke up the next morning with the aftertaste of that dinner still sitting like a stone in my chest, I decided that if Ethan wanted to live in a world where volume counted as proof, then I would choose a different world where paper, timing, and the right questions did the talking. So I made coffee, opened my laptop, and began doing the kind of slow, unglamorous work that never looks heroic in the movies, but moves mountains in real life because it is steady, boring, and absolutely lethal too. Sloppy ego. I started with what he had spilled between jokes, and while most of the family heard only a victory lap, I heard a trail of breadcrumbs, so I wrote down the client name he bragged about as if it were a trophy, the vendor he mocked for late shipments as if insults could speed delivery, and the hint about weekend coverage he treated like an inconvenience instead of a promise to paying customers. Then I dug through public records, business directories, and vendor forums where crews complain about dispatch delays and managers nod along because they have all seen the same fire drills at odd hours that separate talkers from operators. Before noon, I called Carla, because when the ground starts to shift, you want the kind of attorney who answers quietly and does not waste your time telling you how sharp she is, and I laid out the facts without the family drama, explaining that I suspected a credit line tied to receivables, that I saw heavy reliance on a single anchor contract with service-level penalties, and that I wanted to understand what a path might look like if a motivated buyer offered continuity, quick cash to a tired lender, and cleaner operations to a client who just wants their buildings to open on time without alarms screaming at dawn. And Carla, who has this calm that makes you breathe slower, said that if my hunches were right, then the path would not be impossible. It would simply require patience, verified numbers, and the discipline to say less than I knew. The next step was social. Not loud social like posting a victory selfie, but real social, which is the quiet trust between people who fix problems at strange hours. So I reached out to Jordan Alvarez in procurement at the company Ethan would not stop name-dropping, and I did not mention my brother, my family, or any plan that would sound like the start of a feud. I just asked if he would have coffee with someone who understands why a building manager hates fake windows like sometime in the afternoon, and why a missed keycard reprogram can wreck a whole floor's morning, and Jordan, who strikes me as a person who values competence more than performance, said yes. At that coffee, I did not pitch a takeover or wave a flag. I asked about pain points he keeps seeing, and he told me in that measured way procurement people have that response times matter, that weekend coverage fails too often because owners want golf more than dispatch, and that he would switch vendors tomorrow if he believed the new operator had backup crews, clean logs, and a single escalation number that reaches a human who can move trucks without waiting for permission, and I nodded. Because that language was my home field, and I described, purely as a hypothetical, how a service recovery protocol can credit a facility manager without turning the accounting department into a war zone, and how an on-call rotation with real authority can cut the average downtime by hours, and he listened. Then he asked me if I could prove it without theatrics, and I said I could. Back at my desk, I set up calls with a payroll software contact who owes me a favor, not for anything shady, but for the kind of aggregated benchmarks that reveal whether crews are staffed like a promise or staffed like a wish. And the picture that formed did not surprise me at all. Rushed hiring in spring, overtime spikes in summer, thin weekend coverage in fall, and the kind of December where everything runs hot and people quit because being blamed for bad planning gets old. Which meant the company was not broken beyond repair, it was simply being run by a man who thought energy could hide thin margins, which it never does for long. That evening I sent Ethan a breezy message that sounded like a harmless sisterly check-in, telling him his expansion updates sounded exciting and asking, with real curiosity, how he was coordinating weekend dispatch now that the new client was ramping. And, because he loves an audience even when it is only his own reflection, he sent back a careless stream of details, including a note about a supervisor he thought was weak and a line about training wheels off in a month, which, translated, meant he had pulled experienced staff off the hardest slots and hoped new hires would magically learn under pressure, and I thanked him with a smiley word he would not notice and put my phone down. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a man who underestimates you is let him keep talking until he underestimates himself right into a corner. With Carla, I sketched a clean, boring memo that any lender would love, the kind that promises continuity of service, assumes the right slice of debt so no one panics, and lays out an operations plan that does not need heroics to work. And I told her I was not here to humiliate anyone. I was here to honor the people who actually kept that business alive by showing up when it was dark and cold and thankless. And I meant it. Because revenge without competence is just noise, and I had no interest in noise. I wanted results that would make even my father's folded arms relax. By the end of the week, I had 3 things that mattered more than pride, which were a lender's appetite to be made whole, a procurement lead's curiosity about a more reliable weekend, and a brother who could not stop narrating his own weak spots. And as I copied my notes into a tidy folder and set an early alarm, I felt the strange steadiness that shows up when you realize the game is not about shouting the right words at a table. It is about putting the right numbers in front of the right people at the right time, which is slower, quieter, and in the end much louder where it counts. 80% of success depends on this simple habit that almost no one keeps, which is to show up when the building is still dark and the phones are already ringing, and tomorrow, when an emergency call tests everything I just promised. We will see whether talk wins or whether preparation does, because I am done asking for respect and ready to earn the only kind that lasts. By the time another week had passed, I had collected enough information and enough confidence to see that what had first looked like a casual insult at a family dinner had actually been the spark that forced me to notice just how exposed Ethan really was. And once I started seeing the structure of his company not as a monument to his supposed genius, but as a rickety scaffold balanced on borrowed money and staff goodwill, it became almost impossible to unsee it, so I kept pressing forward with the calm certainty that every next step would move me closer to something that could not be laughed away with a smirk and a cutting remark. Carla had been steady throughout, reminding me that enthusiasm is never a substitute for due diligence, so she walked me line by line through the debt covenants Ethan had signed. And each clause read less like a safety net and more like a trap door waiting to open if the wrong number fell at the wrong time, because the lender he had tied himself to was not the kind of bank that had patience for personality. It was a regional finance firm with a reputation for quick loans and quicker repossessions if terms were missed, and according to the documents we examined, Ethan was already skating dangerously close to breaching his obligations on receivables turnover, equipment depreciation schedules, and minimum liquidity thresholds. That meant he had mortgaged not only the company trucks and service equipment, but also the actual flow of cash from clients, and if those clients ever delayed payment or pulled back on scope, the lender would swoop in like a hawk. Rather than feeling triumphant about discovering this, I felt strangely calm, because all of Ethan's bravado at the dinner table had been built on the idea that he was untouchable, that his growth was inevitable, and that anyone outside his circle of bravado was simply too weak to understand business. Yet here I was, holding clear evidence that the structure he depended on was fragile, conditional, and in need of a steady hand that could reassure both the lender and the clients. Carla pointed out that while the debt looked messy, it also meant opportunity, because a lender with no faith in the current operator would often leap at a buyer who promised continuity, payroll stability, and client satisfaction, especially if that buyer could also absorb or restructure the outstanding obligations without causing disruption. I spent long nights drafting a framework of what I could actually offer, and the truth is that I had no intention of playing games with smoke and mirrors, because to win cleanly in this arena, you have to present numbers that make sense on their own. So I worked out an offer that combined assumption of part of the outstanding debt with enough upfront cash to calm the lender's nerves, while simultaneously protecting the payroll so that the workers, the same workers Ethan mocked for being replaceable, would know that their jobs and benefits were safe. The offer was not flashy, not glamorous, and certainly not something Ethan would ever brag about, but it was precise, professional, and entirely aligned with what both the lender and the clients cared about: getting their money, getting their service, and avoiding chaos. The more I built this plan, the clearer it became to me that my brother's loudness had always been a cover for how little patience he had for the details that make a company truly sustainable, because he cared about image and about being the one who held the room. Yet the truth of business is that contracts, service logs, and payroll runs hold more weight than speeches, and in that gap between his noise and my preparation, I found the space to move. Carla's advice was simple but critical. Keep everything boring, because boring deals close while flashy deals collapse, so I stripped the plan of unnecessary flourishes and left only what mattered: continuity clauses, service guarantees, clean financial assumptions, and employee retention. At the same time, I quietly reached out to a funding partner I had worked with before on smaller projects, someone who knew that my strength was not charisma but precision, and I explained that the opportunity was not speculative but operational. That the service business in question was not failing because the demand was gone, but because it was being mismanaged by someone who believed image was strategy, and that with the right hands at the wheel it could be stabilized and scaled without drama. He listened carefully, asked a handful of sharp questions, and finally said that if Carla could confirm the legal side, then he would be willing to back me with the resources I needed to present a credible buyout package. What struck me most in those days was how little of this process resembled the kind of dramatic revenge Ethan might have imagined me plotting if he ever thought I had the courage to fight back, because there were no screaming confrontations, no viral moments of humiliation, and no wild gambles. Instead, there were spreadsheets, memos, calls with attorneys, and meetings with partners who valued steadiness, and I began to realize that this was revenge only in the sense that it corrected the imbalance he had enforced for years. More than that, it was simply a better way of doing business that made his arrogance irrelevant. When the draft proposal was finally ready, I sat with Carla to review it one last time, and she looked at me with that expression she reserves for moments when clients are about to cross a line they can never walk back, and she said, "Once you send this letter of interest to the lender, Ava, you need to understand that it becomes real, and once it becomes real there is no space left for hesitation." I nodded because I already knew. I wanted it to be real. So I sent it, not with fanfare or an announcement to my family, but with a carefully worded cover note that emphasized stability, continuity, and competence. Within a day, the lender replied with an invitation to meet. They wanted out of Ethan's shadow, and I had just offered them daylight. This changes the rules forever, I thought as I closed my laptop that night, because Ethan had always believed the rules were about who could shout loudest across a dinner table, but I had finally understood that the real rules were written in documents, in contracts, and in signatures that carry weight even when no one is laughing. And in that realization, I felt the first taste of a victory that no insult could erase. When the first real signals came back confirming that both the lender and the key client were interested in listening further, I understood that the time for talking was already over and that any extra word could only damage what was quietly taking shape. So I committed myself to a discipline that my brother Ethan had never once managed to practice, which was the power of silence, because silence, when paired with action, is heavier than speeches and more effective than any social post dressed up as confidence. Ethan, true to his nature, had begun to sense that something was shifting even if he could not put his finger on it, and instead of responding with focus, he did what he always did: he doubled down on noise. Releasing an overconfident update on his business page about unstoppable growth, a new fleet expansion, and a future so bright that no one would dare question him. Yet anyone with eyes could see that the photos he posted were recycled from earlier months. And anyone with ears could hear the nervous strain in his voice that betrayed how much of it was bluster. I ignored it because engaging with his noise would only validate it, and instead I concentrated on the weekend coverage trial that Jordan in procurement had quietly arranged, which was the real test of whether my promises were more than words. That weekend the phone rang twice, once for a critical lock system failure in a downtown office and once for a flooded restroom that threatened to shut down a tenant's operations, and while Ethan was busy posting pictures from a golf event, my standby crew, assembled carefully with supervisors who had been overlooked and underpaid, handled both emergencies with precision, speed, and the kind of calm confidence that makes building managers remember your name. Reports came back clean. The downtime was minimal, and the client sent notes of appreciation, and none of it required me to make a grand statement or a dramatic appearance. because the results spoke louder than Ethan ever could. Carla kept pressing forward with the lender, finalizing terms that protected payroll and benefits for the staff, which mattered to me more than any victory over my brother. Because I had seen too many companies collapse, not because the contracts vanished, but because the people who carried the work lost faith in the leadership. We locked in clauses that guaranteed continuity of employment, and I drafted the day one memo that would go to every employee once the transition became official, making sure it was clear, steady, and focused on the future, not on the failure of the past. In those words, I was already practicing silence as strategy, because I understood that nothing would inflame resentment faster than framing the change as personal revenge. So instead, I wrote about reliability, client trust, and the promise of being respected in a way they had not been before. Meanwhile, Ethan, oblivious as always, was still throwing his weight around, mocking supervisors he considered weak, over-promising to clients who were already skeptical, and assuring our parents that he was about to close the biggest deal of his life. I let him talk, I let him preen, and I said nothing to my family, because if I had revealed even a fraction of what I was doing, they would have tried to stop me. Not because they wanted to protect Ethan, but because silence and neutrality had always been their default, and any act that disrupted that balance would have been treated as betrayal. So I denied them the chance to interfere, and I carried the burden alone, which was difficult but also strangely liberating, because for once I was not waiting for permission, I was writing the rules myself. The reputational stakes were growing higher every day, because Ethan's version of the story was still dominating in the eyes of the family and his small circle of admirers, and if I had slipped even once, if the weekend coverage had failed, if the lender had wavered, if the client had lost patience, I would have looked like exactly the failure he accused me of being, only now with proof. Yet that pressure only sharpened my resolve, and I began to see how much of leadership is simply the willingness to stay silent until you have something undeniable to show, because once the evidence exists, words are redundant. By the middle of the week, Jordan called to confirm what I already knew. The trial had impressed procurement, and, while no official shift in contracts would be declared yet, the team was preparing to recommend a permanent transition once legal ownership changed hands. That was the confirmation I needed to know that silence was not just a shield, it was a weapon, because while Ethan was still busy telling the world how unstoppable he was, the people who actually mattered, the ones signing checks, the ones managing buildings, the ones lending money, were already aligning with me. As the final documents began to take shape, Carla reminded me again that discretion was not cowardice, but strategy, and I held my ground, saying nothing to anyone outside the circle who needed to know. I kept my head down, I kept drafting, and I kept preparing the operational structure for day one, so that when the moment came, I would not need to argue, I would simply execute. Stop everything and focus, I told myself the night before the signing was scheduled, because tomorrow, pens would come out, money would move, and silence would end with ink. Ethan thought his reputation was still untouchable, but what he never understood is that reputations are not built on noise, they are built on consistency, and once the signatures dried, no amount of boasting would save his. The morning of the closing felt like the kind of day you imagine for years without ever saying out loud, because even though the path to it had been built slowly, with documents, meetings, quiet strategy, and countless moments of restraint, there was still something breathtaking about knowing that once the signatures were made and the wires confirmed, the narrative my brother had controlled for years with his laughter and his arrogance would finally be dismantled not by an argument across a family table, but by the black ink of a pen pressed to paper, the kind that no one can erase once it has been filed and recorded. Carla had the documents stacked neatly, her calm composure giving me the assurance that nothing had been missed, and the lender's representative arrived already prepared to let go of a burden they had grown tired of carrying. Because for them this was not about revenge or family drama, it was about recovering value from a relationship that had become unreliable, and I represented the path to stability, something Ethan had promised but never delivered. The transfer of ownership, The assumption of debt, the clauses about continuity of employment, and the guarantees to the client all sat within those pages, and when I signed my name, I felt something shift deep inside me. Not a rush of triumph or a scream of victory, but the profound stillness that comes when the weight you have carried for years finally slides off your shoulders. The wires confirmed within hours, and by the time the money had settled, the business Ethan had once flaunted as his proof of superiority no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me, and with that ownership came the authority to make decisions that would reshape not only how the company operated, but how its people felt about showing up every day, because while Ethan treated them as tools, I treated them as the actual foundation of everything. My first act was not to gloat, not to stage a dramatic entrance, but to call an all-hands meeting where I introduced myself not as a conqueror, but as the new steward of the company's future. The employees filed in with guarded expressions, many of them nervous about what a change in ownership might mean for their jobs, their hours, and their benefits, but I looked them in the eye and told them that their pay, their health insurance, and their vacation time would remain intact, and that in fact the new structure would include clearer rotations, stronger backup crews, and a policy that rewarded reliability rather than punished mistakes made in impossible conditions. I did not talk about Ethan. I did not mention the past. I only spoke about the future, and in that moment I saw something soften in their posture. A collective exhale that told me I had won them not with speeches, but with the assurance that they finally had leadership that valued them. Ethan, of course, was present, because until that very moment he had still clung to the belief that somehow this was a misunderstanding or a deal he could talk his way out of, and when the reality sank in that the lender had released him, the client had chosen me, and the documents bore my signature, he did what he always did. He tried to dominate the room. He raised his voice, belittled the process, and declared that no one could fire him from the company he had built with his own hands. Yet the truth was already printed on every page, and the HR representative, who had quietly documented his performance failures, his missed obligations, and his repeated violations of company policy, stepped in to deliver the official termination. I did not shout. I did not sneer. I simply confirmed the decision with steady words, offering him the dignity of a clean exit if he chose to take it, but his pride would not allow it. He scoffed, muttered insults, and stormed out, leaving behind the silence of a room that no longer belonged to him. The employees looked at me, waiting to see what would come next, and I answered not with drama, but with a promotion. The supervisor he had mocked and sidelined for months was immediately named operations lead. A move that drew quiet smiles and gave everyone present proof that the era of contempt had ended. After that, I walked the floor of the shop, speaking with crews who had long felt invisible, and I gave procurement the new escalation hotline number that would be staffed 24 hours a day by someone authorized to make real decisions. A simple change that cost little, but meant everything to the client who had grown tired of excuses. Every move I made that day was small, measured, and grounded in respect, but each one landed like a hammer, because it revealed in real time how different leadership feels when it is built on competence instead of ego. By the time I returned home that night, the reality had fully sunk in. The man who had once called me a failure had lost the very ground he had built his identity upon, not because I shouted louder, but because I refused to play his game at all. The company was mine. The employees were secure, the client was satisfied, and the lender was relieved, and for the first time in my life, I did not need validation from my parents or anyone else at that table. Because the proof of my worth no longer lived in their opinions, it lived in signatures, contracts, and results. I was called a failure, and I believed it for longer than I should have, but when I finally stopped defending myself and started building quietly, I discovered that success does not need to announce itself, it simply arrives in the form of undeniable change. I bought the story Ethan had been telling about himself for years, and when I signed those papers, I ended his job, rewrote the ending, and proved once and for all that the only strategy worth trusting is the one that lets silence do the talking until the truth cannot be ignored.